Speaker Boehner suggested this morning that he might be looking for some concessions related to health care bill, this so-called risk corridor provision, or repealing the medical device act.
Remarks from Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid. We will leave this here and now go back to the Senate floor live.
Represent the most ambitious proposal ever to use federal dollars to enable states to allow parents to use those federal dollars to find a better school for their child. I'd like to talk for a few minutes about my proposal, which is called Scholarships for Kids, the context in which we find ourselves today as we look forward to the President's State of the Union address. And I'd like to mention briefly the proposal of Senator Scott from South Carolina. He's already introduced his bill. He'll be on the floor at another time to talk about it. But they're big ideas. Together they represent redirecting about 35 to 36 billion federal dollars that are now being spent through a series of programs, and instead spending them in a way that better fits the age in which we find ourselves, an age in which the best federal investments can be made in things that enable Americans to do things for ourselves, to make our lives better and happier and safer and longer. Let me talk first about Scholarship for Kids, and if I may ask unanimous consent that this description of the Scholarship for Kids Act of 2014 be included following my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. The legislation that I'm introducing today would allow up to 11 million new federal scholarships to follow low-income children to any school their parents choose, as long as it's accredited. Now, it's not a federal mandate. It would enable states to create those choice options. But it would mean about a $2,100 scholarship of federal dollars on top of the money that states already spend on elementary and secondary education for each child. The state of Tennessee, for example, that spends nearly $9,000 per child, this would be taking $2,100 for the one-fifth of the students who are low income and allow that money to follow them to the school they attend. Our country is united not by race, but by a set of principles upon which we agree. And one of the most important of these is the principle of equal opportunity. For me, equal opportunity means creating an environment where the largest number of people can begin at the same starting line. And I believe this is a real answer to the inequality in America that we hear so much about, giving children more opportunity to attend a better school. The Scholarships for Kids Act will cost $24 billion a year. It'll be paid for by redirecting about 41% of all the dollars we now spend on federal elementary and secondary education programs. About 90% of all the spending on our elementary and secondary schools is state and local spending. 9 or 10% is federal spending. This is 41% of that 9 or 10%. It includes all of the money federal government spends on elementary and secondary except money for children with disabilities, and Senator Scott's legislation addresses that. It does not touch the school lunch program. It doesn't affect federal research in education, and it doesn't affect impact aid. The whole purpose of federal aid to elementary and secondary education is to help low-income students. But unfortunately, often the federal dollars are diverted to schools with wealthier students. The left and the right both have noticed this and would like to change it. Scholarships for Kids, our proposal, would benefit only children that fit the federal definition of poverty, which is about one-fifth of all school children. That's because it would pin the $2,100 scholarship to the blouse or the shirt of the child, and it would follow that child to the school that the state and the local school district say that child should attend. Allowing federal dollars to follow students to a school has been a successful strategy in American education for more than 70 years. Last year, $33 billion in federal grants to colleges, we call them Pell Grants, and $106 billion in loans for students followed those students to public and private colleges. Since the GI Bill began in 1944, these vouchers, and that's what they are, have helped create a marketplace of about 6,000 autonomous higher education institutions, a higher education system that is regarded by almost everyone as the best in the world. Our elementary and secondary education system is not the best in the world. The United States 15-year-olds rank 28th in science and 36th in math. I believe one reason for this is that while more than 93% of federal dollars are spent for higher education, but 93% of the dollars that we spend through the federal government for higher education follow students to the colleges of their choice. But federal dollars do not automatically follow students to the elementary or secondary school of their choice. Instead, with our elementary schools and our middle schools and our high schools, money is sent directly to the schools. Local government monopolies run most of those schools, and they tell most students exactly which school to attend. There's little choice and no K-12 marketplace as there is in higher education. Again, in higher education, you have the 6,000 institutions, you have generous amounts of federal dollars. They can follow you to the college or university of your choice, whether it's public or private or nonprofit or profit, as long as it's accredited. And so students may go to Harvard or Yeshiva or Notre Dame or to the Otto Diesel College or to the University of Tennessee or the community college nearby. The former Librarian of Congress, Daniel Boorstin, often wrote that American creativity flourishes during fertile verges. That was his description. He called those times when Americans become more self-aware and more creative. In his book, Breakout, Newt Gingrich argues that society is on the edge of such a new era, the Internet age, an age when everything will change, like everything changed at the time of the new internal combustion engine many years ago. Newt Gingrich, in his book, cites computer handbook writer Tim O'Reilly for his suggestion about how the Internet could transform government. Here's how Tim O'Reilly says that we ought to do our job as we try to help use the government to help Americans during this period of time. The best way for government to operate, O'Reilly says, is to figure out what kind of things are enablers of society and make investments in those things. The same way that Apple figured out, if we turn the iPhone into a platform, outside developers will bring hundreds of thousands of applications to the table. Already, 16 states have begun a variety of innovative programs supporting private school choice. Private organizations in many parts of our country supplement these efforts. Scholarships for Kids, allowing $2,100 federal scholarships to follow 11 million children, would enable other school choice innovations in the same way that developers rush to provide applications for the iPhone platform. Senator Tim Scott, as I mentioned earlier, the senator from South Carolina, has proposed what he calls the Choice Act. It would allow 11 billion other federal dollars that the federal government now spends through programs for children with disabilities to follow these 6 million children to the schools their parents believe provides the best services. So there might be a child in Tennessee or Wisconsin or South Carolina who is eligible both for the Scholarship for Kids because he or she comes from a family that fits the federal poverty definition. So there's $2,100. Then if that child is also disabled, the child might be eligible for a scholarship under the Choice Act of several thousand dollars. That would then be in addition to the amount of money that South Carolina, let's say, spends on education per child, which is probably in the neighborhood of $8,000 or $9,000 or $10,000. So to take the case of Tennessee, again, $9,000 or so for the state, $2,100 more federal dollars through scholarship for kids, a few more $1,000 depending upon circumstances for the scholarship under Senator Scott's Act, and you have a significant amount of money that a parent could use to follow a child to a school that helps that child succeed, especially in the case of children with disabilities. That would seem to me to make so much good sense. Senator Scott tells a poignant story of a young girl in South Carolina who was in a kindergarten. She has Down syndrome. She's in a kindergarten that helped her succeed, but then her parents moved, and they had to fight for a year to get her in another school that would treat her in a mainstream way, and then they realized that the school they'd been fighting for a year was the one they were counting on. Well, why not let that family take the $13,000, $14,000, $15,000, $16,000 with that child with Down syndrome, pick a school that treasures that child, and let the money follow the child to the school the child attends. So a student with both low income and a disability would benefit under both programs. As I said when I began my remarks, taken together with Senator Scott's proposal, scholarships for kids constitutes the most ambitious proposal ever to use existing federal dollars to enable states to expand school choice. Now, importantly, Madam President, this is not a federal mandate. Washington is full of politicians who fly an hour, hour and a half from their hometown and get here and think they've suddenly gotten smarter. They have a good idea and they say, oh, let's apply that in Wisconsin and in Tennessee and in South Carolina. I try not to do that. I'm a very strong believer, for example, in teacher evaluation. I led the fight for that as governor of Tennessee 30 years ago. We were the first state to do it. And when I come to Washington, people said, well, then you'll want to make everybody do that. And my answer is, no, I won't. States have the opportunity to be right, and they have the opportunity to be wrong. And the last thing Tennessee needs is the federal government peering over the shoulders of communities and school districts and legislators and governors and school boards who are trying to work out a very difficult problem of teacher evaluation. It's the holy grail of education as far as I'm concerned, but not mandated from Washington. I very much believe in school choice, but not mandated from Washington. So under scholarship for kids, states still would govern pupil assignment, deciding, for example, whether parents could choose private schools. When I was education secretary years ago, Milwaukee was in the midst of a major program to try to give low-income parents more choice of schools, including private schools. So along with President Bush, what President Bush proposed, President George H.W. Bush, what we called a GI Bill for kids to allow Milwaukee and Wisconsin to do that if it wished to do it. But it didn't impose what we thought was a good idea from Washington. Under scholarship for kids, schools that are chosen by parents for the $2,100 scholarship would have to be accredited. Federal civil rights rules would apply. The proposal does not affect school lunches, and so that Congress can assess the effectiveness of the new tool for innovation, there's an independent evaluation after 5 years. In remarks that Senator Scott and I made this morning, the issue came up about private schools, which always does when we talk about expanding school choice. But in this case, we're not necessarily talking about private schools. Most schools are public schools. And I would assume that most of these $2,100 scholarships would follow students to the school they attend, which would be a public school. But if a state chose to create a program whereby its citizens, its low-income citizens, could choose a private school as long as it was accredited, that would be appropriate under the law. And why shouldn't a low-income family have more of the same opportunities for a better school for its child that a wealthier family does who may move to a different part of town or may be able to afford a private school? The idea of allowing dollars to follow students to the school of their choice has not been an idea that's exclusively an idea of the left or of the right in our country. In the late 1960s, the most conspicuous proposal for school choice was from Ted Sizer, then the Harvard University education dean. He suggested a $5,000 scholarship in the 1960s, which he called a Poor Children's Bill of Rights. That $5,000 scholarship today would be worth 2 or 3 times as much. In 1992, as I mentioned earlier, when I was Education Secretary, President George H.W. Bush proposed a GI Bill for kids, a $500 million federal pilot program for states creating school choice opportunities. Yet despite its success in higher education, and despite the fact it's had powerful advocates on both the left and the right, the word voucher remains a bad word among most of the kindergarten through the 12th grade education establishment, and the idea has not spread widely. Madam President, equal opportunity in America should mean that everyone, as much as possible, has the same starting line. During this week celebrating school choice, there would be no better way to help children move up from the back of the line than by allowing states to use federal dollars to create 11 million new opportunities to choose a better school. Now, Madam President, if I may conclude with a word about the context in which we find ourselves today. Senator Scott and I made our remarks today at American Enterprise Institute, and I'm speaking today on the floor of the Senate on a very important day in our country's history. It's not only School Choice Week, but it is the day that the President of the United States makes his annual State of the Nation address. Every president has done that except 2, the Senate historian told us at lunch today, and those 2 died before it was time to make the address. So it's a tradition that goes back to the beginning of our country. And we'll all go over to the House of Representatives and we'll listen carefully, and the country will watch to listen to what the president has to say. The issue, we're told, that the president will address is the one of income inequality. And if that's what he does, that's certainly an appropriate issue for any American president. Because if equal opportunity is central to the American character, so is the idea of the American dream, the idea that anything is possible, that anyone can go from the back to the front of the line with hard work. And equal opportunity, therefore, helps to create a starting line from which we move. If the president makes that proposal, I think we know the kind of agenda we're likely to hear. It will have to do with more minimum wages that actually cost jobs. It will have to do with more compensation for perpetual unemployment. It will have to do with canceling more health insurance policies, which is what Obamacare will be doing in 2014, much more so than it did in 2013. There is another agenda, another picture, another vision of how we can help the largest number of Americans realize the American dream. And that is more jobs, more job training, and more choices for low-income parents of better schools for their children so they can get a better job. So instead of more minimum wages, which actually reduce the number of jobs, we would liberate the free enterprise system of the wet blanket of Obamacare and other Obama rules and regulations and create lots more jobs with good wages. Instead of more compensation for long-term unemployment, we would say, let's have more job training so you can take one of these good new jobs that we propose to create. And then, instead of directing the money to a model that hasn't worked as well over the last 70 years, let's take the federal dollars we're now spending, 36 billion of them, and let them follow low-income children and disabled children to the schools of their parents' choice so they, like children who aren't disabled and like parents who have more money, have an opportunity to go to a better school. We will be arguing that a better agenda for income equality, to realize the American dream, to help Americans move from the back to the front of the line, is more jobs, more job opportunities, and more choices of better schools for low-income children. That agenda is especially right for the age we're in. I mentioned the discussion that Daniel Boorstin said about America's Fertile Virgins and about Newt Gingrich's book and about the suggestion by the computer programmer that the best way for government to operate is not with Washington mandates or Washington programs, but to spend money on things that enable each of us as Americans to do things for ourselves, to live a happier life, to live a better life, to live a wealthier life, to live a safer life. And I hope that in the remarks I've made today, I've done that. Because we have 70 years of experience with just such programs in education. I would argue there may be no more successful social program in American history than the GI Bill for veterans. It began 70 years ago in 1944, and it did not send money to the University of Chicago and Tennessee and Michigan and Harvard. It followed the money. It followed the soldier and the airman and the Navy veteran to the college of his or her choice. We began that practice in 1944. We followed it with the Pell Grants today. We followed it with the student loans today. Why should we not follow it with the federal dollars we spend for elementary and secondary education? If federal dollars following students to the colleges of their choice help to produce the finest higher education system in the world, why should we not allow states to try it, to try to create the best schools in the world for our children, especially our low-income children? So, Madam President, I hope that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will recognize that this isn't a proposal of the left or the right. I don't know many Democrats who want to get rid of Pell Grants or student loans. They are vouchers, pure and simple. They are vouchers that have lasted for 70 years and may be the most successful social program we have. So why not allow states in this internet age to take the federal dollars we're already spending for low-income children and make sure the money gets directly to them, and for disabled children and make sure it goes directly to them, and give their parents an opportunity to exercise the same kind of decisions that wealthier parents do, and say, what would the school be that's best for my child? Would that not be a way to help a young American get a leg up on moving to the same starting line that children from wealthier families have, and maybe a chance to move even to the head of the line? Hope my colleagues and the American people will take a good look at scholarships for kids and Senator Scott's Choice Act. Together they constitute the most ambitious proposal ever to use existing federal dollars to enable states to allow parents, especially low-income parents, to choose a better school for their child. There's no better way to create opportunity in America. I thank the President, and I yield the floor.
A break in debate on the floor of the Senate, and when we do hear from another senator, we expect more debate on the flood insurance bill. We also learned that in just a couple of minutes, at 2:45, Democrat Senator Chris Murphy of Kentucky will deliver a speech that opposes a Republican proposal to strip health care coverage from about 10 million Americans and dramatically increase the cost of health care for middle-class families. This proposal is introduced by Senators Orrin Hatch, Tom Coburn, and Richard Burr, and it comes on the heels of the 40th time Republicans in Congress have tried to repeal the Affordable Care Act without any substantive alternative.
Madam President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Madam President, I'd ask that we dispense with the quorum call.
Senate is not in a quorum call.
Okay, thank you. Madam President, it's been 1,406 days since the President signed into law the Affordable Care Act. Since that time, about 10 million Americans who have not had access to affordable insurance have gotten it. And patients have been re-empowered along with their doctors to take control of their own health care, taking power back away from the insurance company who had run our medical lives for too long. The presiding officer and I lived through dozens of votes in the House of Representatives to repeal the bill, as the Senate saw as well. But absolutely no genuine effort to replace the health care bill. I was sitting in the chair yesterday when one of our colleagues, Senator Hatch, came down to the floor to talk about a new proposal. I would probably argue the first proposal from Republicans in 1,406 days to actually talk about what their vision, what Republicans' vision for health care reform would be. This is a framework, not a bill, just a framework that has been suggested by our colleagues, Senator Hatch and Senator Coburn and Senator Burr. I want to come down to the floor today to talk about the implications of this framework for affordability and patient protections all across this country. First of all, let me say I give some credit to our colleagues because it's been 1,406 days of complaint, of politics, of obfuscation, of obstruction. And at least for the first time, we are beginning to see what the Republican vision for the future of health care in this country is. And though we don't have a bill, all we have at this point is a framework. It's a pretty scary future because the proposal from our Republican colleagues would dramatically increase the cost of health care for millions of Americans and would put back in charge the insurance companies of our health care. And so I wanted to just come down for a few minutes today and try to talk in real terms about what this proposal will actually do for health care in this country. And I only have a few minutes, so it's hard to really go through the litany of backward steps that we would take were we to adopt the proposal that's been laid out here by a couple of our very brave Republican colleagues. The first thing it would do is it would reinstate the fact that being a woman for decades in this country was considered to be a pre-existing condition. The health care reform bill says very simply that there can be no difference in the amount of money that you pay for health care based on your gender. Because the facts are plain. Women have historically paid 50% more in terms of health care costs than men have across this country. $1 billion is the total amount of money that women have paid more than men simply because insurance companies believe that being a woman is a pre-existing condition. That is no longer the law of the land. Women pay the same rate as men. There is no difference based on your gender. That would be eliminated by this plan. Once again, being a woman could be considered a pre-existing condition. Second, annual limits on the ability of you to recoup the cost of your health care from your insurance company would be reimposed. The health care bill says, listen, it just isn't fair that you buy a insurance policy, you get really, really sick, and then you get told at some point midway through the year that your insurance is up. That's not real insurance. The idea of insurance is that we all pool our risk together, and that if one of us, through no fault of our own, gets sick, that we actually get those insurance bills paid. Well, the Affordable Care Act says that there can't be any more annual limits, but the proposal from our Republican friends would say that annual limits can come back from insurance companies. And to somebody like Deborah Gauvin from Connecticut, who had a $20,000 limit, was diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer, hit her limit about halfway through the year, incurred $18,000 of additional cost, causing her to basically forego treatment. Once again, that painful reality of an insurance plan not delivering on insurance simply because you got so sick that you had big costs would once again be the reality. The Republican plan would allow for annual limits again. Our friends talk about the fact that they address the issue of pre-existing conditions, but they really don't. They really don't, because all their plan says is that if you switch plans and you have no gap, that the new plan has to cover whatever illness you may have. But that's not how life works. 89 million Americans on the average year have at least a 1-month gap in coverage. And that 1-month gap in coverage under the Republican plan that's been shown to us in a basic framework would allow for pre-existing condition discrimination to once again be the law. Betty Berger, one of my constituents, had insurance her entire life except for basically about a 1 or 2 month period of time where her husband was switching jobs. And during that time, their son was diagnosed with cancer. The new insurance company at her husband's new employer wouldn't cover the pre-existing condition, and the Bergers lost everything. They lost their home, they lost their savings, their lives were financially ruined. The Affordable Care Act ends that nightmare for families that cause 50% of bankruptcies in this country to be caused by medical debt. The Republican plan does not fix the pre-existing condition discrimination. All it says is that if you don't have any change any gap in your coverage, then the new insurance company has to cover your pre-existing condition. But for millions of families, that's not how life works. And then lastly, although the Republican plan does acknowledge that the basic underlying wisdom of the Affordable Care Act is right, in that the best way to get coverage to people is to give them a tax credit with which to go buy private insurance. That is the foundation of the Affordable Care Act, and the Republican alternative that our colleagues introduced basically adopts that as their framework for expanding coverage as well. It is at a much lesser subsidy rate with much greater tax consequences to Americans than the Affordable Care Act has in it. For instance, the Republican alternative says that if you hit 300% of the poverty level, that's it, no more subsidy. Well, 300% sounds like a lot. 300 is a big number, but the poverty level is pretty measly in this country, and if you're making 300% of the poverty level, you're making $34,000 a year. And I don't know about the presiding officer's state, but in Connecticut, it's really hard to put food on the table on a consistent basis at $34,000 a year. And then to have no help from the government to buy insurance essentially means that you will have a huge class of people making $30,000 to $40,000 a year who under the Affordable Care Act are getting help to buy insurance, who under this alternative plan will get no help. But here's how it's even worse. The Republican alternative that we've seen this framework on says that one of the ways that we're going to pay for this is by taxing people for the health care that they're getting. Right now, if you get health care through your employer, which 150 million Americans do, you get to essentially exclude that money from from taxation. You get those benefits in pre-tax dollars. The Republicans have said, well, we're going to allow that to happen, but only for about 65% of your benefit. So just under half of your health care is now going to be taxable. That is a massive tax increase on the people of this country. Now, we can debate whether there's policy wisdom in limiting the tax exclusion of health care, but let's just admit that if you're going to fund your proposal based on eliminating the tax exclusion of employer-sponsored benefits to employees, then you are dramatically raising taxes on middle-class Americans all across this country. So I give a lot of credit to the senators who have put this framework out there, because it's the first time that we've seen any alternative. But it's a pretty miserable alternative for consumers all across this country who have finally, for the first time, because of the Affordable Care Act, gotten access to affordable insurance. And for countless more Americans who have been insured, who finally feel like all of the tricks and the gimmicks that they've seen from insurance companies, like excluding people from coverage because of a pre-existing condition or putting an annual limit on their coverage, those days are over. So as we go into the debate about the effective implementation of the Affordable Care Act, and as we talk about these alternatives that are now being proposed, it's important that we do that with eyes wide open. Nobody on our side of the aisle who supported the health care reform bill is going to tell you that it is perfect. No one on our side of the aisle is going to defend every step of the implementation, but it is changing the lives of millions of Americans. It is reducing the overall health care expenditure of this government, and it is putting Americans back in charge of their health care. Now is not the time to be discussing going back to the good old days when millions of Americans were left out of the rolls and the ranks of those who were insured, and insurance companies dictated the day-to-day, week-to-week, and month-to-month health care that is so critical to the lives of middle-class families. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, tonight President Obama is going to deliver his State of the Union address. He'll be in front of Congress and the TV cameras, and he'll be talking to the American people as well. He and his advisors are probably working right now on some last-minute sound bites and applause lines, and really, Madam President, I would say instead of that, they should be working on an agenda that actually helps unemployed Americans, an agenda that will get our economy back on track. The President doesn't have very many big opportunities left to do this. He is quickly becoming a lame duck president. The President's going to become a lame duck even faster if he comes to the Capitol tonight and delivers a lengthy speech that just attacks Republicans. The economic recession ended 4.5 years ago. Many Americans have still not seen their careers or their finances or their quality of life improve. That's what Americans are looking for. Unfortunately, they haven't found it because of the Obama economy. That's what the Obama economy has done to Americans. Millions of Americans have actually, regrettably, given up looking for work. They're falling further and further behind, further and further away from achieving the dreams that they have had. Is the President going to tell those people that he has no new ideas about how to actually help them? Well, President Obama is failing. He's failing to make it easier for the American economy to recover. And he's failing to help Americans who desperately want to work. He's failing because he is focused on things like extending emergency unemployment benefits, things like raising the minimum wage. Well, an unemployment check can be a vital safety net for families, but it is not a long-term solution for what is becoming a part-time economy under President Obama. Tonight, the President can deliver yet another partisan political speech. He may get a standing ovation here and there from the most liberal side of the aisle, or he can do what he should do as President, focus on solutions with proven bipartisan support. The President has made a point of saying lately that 2014 will be, as he calls it, a year of action. He said he intends to act on his own without waiting for Congress. I believe that would be the wrong course. President Obama has had trouble getting some of his policies through Congress, and the main reason is the American people do not support his policies. He should use this speech tonight to move to the center, to show that he is willing to work with others. He shouldn't give a speech that shows he's moving further to the left. We've had too much of the President's politics of division. The politics of division is hurting the economy, and it's hurting the country. Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill already agree on ideas to get America and Americans back to work. There are many policies that President Obama can talk about in his speech tonight that won't require him to go around Congress, but rather to come to Congress. So I'd like to suggest 3 of them that he should announce tonight. First, the Keystone XL pipeline. The President should say that he will stop blocking construction of the Keystone XL pipeline. His own State Department says that the pipeline construction could support over 42,000 jobs across the country. And a bipartisan group of 62 senators, 62 members of this body, backed the project. Early in 2013, President Obama met with Senate Republicans. He told us that we'd have an answer about the pipeline by the end of the year. That was 2013. The years come, gone. Keystone XL pipeline approval is still sitting on the President's desk. The American people deserve an answer, and the answer should be yes. Now, second, the President really should address his reckless Environment Protection Agency, the EPA, and how its regulations are putting Americans out of work. Recently, the EPA released new requirements for power plants. The requirements are unachievable and they're unnecessary. Now, ironically, the EPA did this on the exact same day as the 50th anniversary of the start of the war on poverty, declared by LBJ. These harsh new regulations are going to cause energy costs to go up. They're going to cause people to lose their jobs as coal plants are forced to close. The job losses and higher prices are going to fall most heavily on people struggling in Appalachia and across coal country. Higher energy costs clearly hurt our economy. The President must sensibly rein in his EPA before it does even more economic damage. Now, third, the President should support bipartisan efforts to repeal his medical device tax. This is a destructive tax, and it was part of the health care law. It's been estimated by some that the tax puts thousands and thousands of American jobs at risk because it helps to push manufacturing overseas. Now, an amendment to repeal that medical device tax passed right here in the Senate last year with a bipartisan vote of 79 to 20. With all of the changes President Obama has made to his health care law, it's barely recognizable. Repealing this tax would be a change that actually helps Americans and not just the president's poll numbers. So there are many things that the president can talk about tonight that have this sort of bipartisan support. These are just three, but they'd be a good place to start. You know, it's interesting, Madam President, that when the president leaves here after the State of the Union, he's going to go visit 4 states, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Madam President, Wisconsin, and then as well Tennessee. 4 states, 8 U.S. senators. When you take a look at who they are, 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats. All 8 of them, the 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats, all were part of the 79 members of this body that voted to repeal the medical device tax. When the president, his spokesman the other day on a Sunday TV show said the president's going to use his phone and his pen, I would say he ought to use the phone to call those 8 senators and say, I'm going to use my pen after you vote to repeal the medical device tax, to sign that into law. That is something that would show bipartisanship on the part of the president, as well as really help with our economy. Madam President, nearly 21 million Americans are out of work or they're trapped in part-time jobs. It's time for President Obama to talk less about divisive ways to redistribute Americans' prosperity and more about helping all Americans increase their own prosperity. America is a strong and resilient nation. We can overcome the Obama economy, and we will. We can overcome and will the bad policies of this administration. The President should come here tonight to the Capitol and say that he is willing to help Americans return to prosperity. If the President announces these 3 policies tonight, the country and the economy will benefit, and a bipartisan group of Republicans and Democrats will all be able then, Madam President, to stand up and applaud. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The Republican whip.
Madam President, I would also like to address the matter of the President's State of the Union speech tonight. I'm sure that, as has been the rule, President Obama will make an eloquent speech. He's really good at that. There's just one problem. The President's credibility has been shattered. Indeed, on issue after issue, we see a massive gap between his rhetoric and the reality. You might say that the 2 biggest challenges the President faces tonight are those 2 challenges, one to his credibility and the other is to his competence and the competence of the federal government to actually be able to deliver on the promises that it makes. Now, the most obvious example is the health care law, which we've heard a lot about and will continue to hear a lot about in this ensuing year. I was just visiting with one health insurance company executive who told me that basically the bad news is going to continue to unroll and unravel over the coming months, and there will be nowhere to hide. Well, perhaps what people want most from Washington, D.C. is accountability. I hear it all the time. People say, what does it take to get fired? Can people promise the sun and the moon and then deliver nothing and without any consequences? How about people who are charged with implementing the policies of the administration, whether it's the website contractor or whomever? Well, the website contractor finally did get fired and a new one hired, so I assume that sooner or later that the website will actually work as advertised. But that still leaves us with the flaws in the underlying policy, which will not work. The American people understand that, and they're looking for help to Washington and saying, please deliver us from this epic failure, which is not what we were promised. And in the event that there isn't a response to that they deem credible, then I promise you there will be an accounting come November 2014. Well, the President said repeatedly under his signature health law that if you liked the coverage you had, you could keep it. Public opinion polls then showed that roughly 90% of the American people liked their health coverage. Now, why in the world did we undermine, or did Obamacare undermine the existing coverage that people liked just in order to try to cover more people, which in fact it did not do? But we know Obamacare has forced millions of Americans to lose their preferred coverage, the coverage they said they liked back in 2009. And the President has repeatedly said that Obamacare will reduce your premiums and make them lower. For a family of four, about $2,500. Well, the stories we've seen day after day after day of American citizens signing up on the health care exchanges is just the opposite. They're experiencing premium shock. And the fact of the matter is it's going to continue to get nothing but worse as people realize that the ones who are signing up for Obamacare are older, sicker Americans, and that young, healthy Americans are simply taking a pass, saying, I can't afford it, and if I have a problem, I'll take care of it later. Well, premiums are going to continue to skyrocket. And Americans who are looking for more affordable health coverage will find out that indeed it's been priced beyond their ability to pay. Well, here's the rub, really. The President said, and I think this was the implicit underlying promise of Obamacare, if you pass Obamacare, Congress, everybody will have coverage. We'll have universal coverage. Well, the Congressional Budget Office has projected that Obamacare, even if it were implemented to perfection, exactly as the proponents and the President had expected, it would still leave 30 million people uninsured. 30 million people uninsured. The President said that this new law would bring a greater sense of certainty to the U.S. health care system. Instead, we've seen one of the credit rating agencies actually slash the credit rating of America's health insurers, citing the uncertainty generated by the implementation of Obamacare, the opposite, again, of what was promised. Well, the President also said that the website, when you plug in your personal information, your Social Security number, your health information that is protected already by federal law, if you plug it into the Obamacare website, it's going to be safe and secure. Well, cyber experts have testified, particularly in the House of Representatives, that security of the website is worse today than it was several months ago. No guarantee that if you put your personal information, your private information, your confidential information into the website, it's going to be protected. And here's the real surprise. I remember when Secretary Sebelius appeared before the Senate Finance Committee just a couple of months ago, and I asked her about the Navigator program. You remember the Navigator program was supposed to get people to help you sign up for Obamacare. And I said, there's no background check, is there, to be a navigator? She said, no. I said, so is it possible that a convicted felon could be a navigator? Somebody you're giving your personal information to help you sign up for Obamacare? She said, to her credit, she said in all candor, yeah, that's possible. I nearly fell out of my chair. Well, the Obamacare's broken promises have caused enormous pain and anxiety in millions of Americans in Texas and all around the country. You see the Wall Street Journal poll that came out this morning, which had to be a wake-up call to the administration and its allies. The American people are anxious. They're dissatisfied. And they're really wondering what has gone so terribly wrong here in Washington, D.C., and Obamacare is Exhibit 1. That's why we're committed on this side of the aisle to working with our colleagues when they're ready to talk to us into replacing Obamacare with patient-centered alternatives that will actually bring down the cost and make it more affordable. And what better way to get more people covered than to make it more affordable and to make sure that government doesn't make these private decisions for us and our family when it comes to health care, but that we, families, get to make that decision in consultation with their family doctor. Well, when you begin to sort of scrape the surface at the President's problem of credibility and competence, those are the two crises that he confronts tonight as he addresses the nation. All we have to do beyond Obamacare is to look at what's happening in the economy. Well, after raising taxes $1.7 trillion, that was about a year ago, during the time President Obama has been President of the United States, the national debt has gone up $6.6 trillion. But my friends across the aisle, many of them, I would exclude the present occupant of the chair, who I know is concerned about this, my friends across the aisle think nothing of bringing legislation to the floor that's unpaid for, that would add to the deficit and that would add to the national debt. And that's the reason why we now have a national debt of in excess of $17 trillion. Well, that's more than any of us can possibly conceive of. But when President Obama became president, the national debt was about $10 trillion. That's bad enough. But in the last 5 years, it's gone up $6.6 trillion, or more than $6.6 trillion. And it's no coincidence that he's presided over the weakest economic recovery since, and the highest unemployment since the Great Depression back in the 30s. President Obama has this very strange idea that the best way to get the economy going is to raise taxes and spend more money. Well, it's just not working. Matter of fact, we have great debates about the role and the size of the federal government here in Congress, but perhaps the best example of why big government does not work has been the lousy economy, the slow economic growth, the high unemployment, and the number of people who have actually dropped out of the workforce. You know, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has this figure that it calculates. It's called the labor participation rate. You can Google Bureau of Labor Statistics or labor participation rate. What you'll find there is the percentage of people between the age of 25 and 54 who are actually actively engaged in looking for work is lower today than it was at the height of the recession in 2008. And another 347,000 people dropped out of the workforce in December alone. I know when we look at the unemployment rates that are released from time to time, we see the rate coming down and a little bit, and we say, well, oh, that's great. The unemployment rate's coming down, but the problem is in December alone, almost 350,000 people quit looking for work. They gave up. And we know that nearly 4 million people who are still looking for work have been out of a job for more than 6 months. Well, that's not an economy to be proud of. Let me just contrast that with what happened in the 80s during the Reagan recovery. You know, typically what economists will tell you is that when you have a recession, it's sort of a V shape. So when it hits bottom, it actually bounces up pretty quickly because it's pretty much, there's nothing but upside left to go. But yet this recession has been more of a U shape. In other words, we hit bottom, but we're still bouncing along the bottom, and we haven't seen the kind of economic growth that we need to get people back to work, to grow our economy, and to get our budget balanced. And I think the reason why is some of the very policies that I've talked about here a moment ago. The same misguided policies that the President has advocated and that he will no doubt talk about again tonight in the State of the Union. I heard my colleague, Senator Brasso from Wyoming, talk about the Keystone XL pipeline. You know, the President liked to say, I've got a pen and I've got a phone and I'm going to go it alone. Well, of course, he can't do that under our Constitution. We all learned in high school about the checks and balances, the three co-equal branches of the government. The President can't spend a penny without Congress appropriating the money. But I guess, you know what, taking him at his word, if he really wants to do something for the economy, to reduce our dependence upon imported energy from dangerous sources abroad, he could use that pen he talked about to authorize the Canadian-American connection between the Keystone XL pipeline. And you then see a lot of the oil and energy produced in Canada, which is combined with the energy added to that pipeline that would make its way down to southeast Texas, where the refineries will turn it into gasoline and jet fuel, and in the process create thousands of new jobs. But rather than using that pen to put people back to work and to make sure that we have safe sources of energy, his administration is working behind the scenes to kill the Keystone XL pipeline. Politics is the only explanation. Well, the President should not be surprised at what this Wall Street Journal poll showed this morning, that most of the voters disapprove of how he's handled the economy. Likewise, he shouldn't be surprised if trust in the federal government has also fallen to historic lows. That's the credibility problem. You can't promise the sun and the moon and deliver squat and expect people to trust you next time when you make another promise. And then there's this. The Obama administration has repeatedly ignored or waived laws that prove inconvenient, from Obamacare to immigration to welfare reform to education, energy, and drug policy. You know, this is one of the most frequent questions my constituents ask me back home in Texas. I said, how can the President do that? I thought we were a nation that believed in the rule of law, that the law applied to everybody in America, no matter how humble your station in life or how exalted, whether you're the commander-in-chief. Well, I guess we have to revisit that, where the President picks and chooses which laws he wants to enforce. Of course, Congress can pass laws. That's what Congress does. But the executive branch is the one that's supposed to enforce the law. And so unless someone files a lawsuit, not Eric Holder in the Department of Justice, one of the most politicized departments of justice that I can even remember, when some private organization or individual, like as recently challenged the contraception mandate in Obamacare that was recently stayed by the Supreme Court of the United States, or some association or business that files a lawsuit that culminates in a judgment of a court years later, but for that, there really isn't much of a check on President Obama. But that can change, and the voters know how to do it by changing who's in charge here in the United States Senate in November. Well, here's another place where the President overreached, where recently he had his hand slapped by the courts. This had to do with his claimed authority to do another end run around Congress to make recess appointments. Now, we all know that under the Constitution, the advice and consent function of the Senate is to act on the President's nominees and to vote to confirm them or not. But again, in a case of the President trying to go it alone, the Court of Appeals slapped down his attempt to do this end run around the Constitution and the advice and consent role of the United States Senate. But that didn't stop him. Now he's threatening to take even more unilateral action. I got my phone, I got a pen, he's ready to do it again. This is not how the federal government is supposed to operate. For example, the President made these unconstitutional recess appointments, and the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals that ruled on them said that if the President, his claim to make that appointment would be upheld, it would, quote, eviscerate the Constitution's separation of powers, the three co-equal branches of government, checks and balances. What could be more fundamental to our form of government? And the Court of Appeals said that the President, if they upheld his claimed power to make those appointments, would eviscerate the Constitution's separation of powers. Now, we know how important the role of checks and balances is in our form of government, in our democracy. Indeed, our democracy would not be able to survive without them. You know, the people who founded this great country knew that the greatest threat to their freedom and their individual liberties and their most basic rights was a concentration of power. And so that's why they separated power at the federal and state level in the 10th Amendment, but they also separated the power here at the federal level between the judicial, the executive, and the legislative. Yet this president and his administration have shown repeated contempt for the checks and balances that are so essential to our form of government. I've said many times, no president has the authority to disregard or selectively enforce the law based on political expediency. If he or she can, then we're nothing better than a banana republic. We are no longer a nation that believes in the rule of law, which has really been the competitive edge that this country has had over other countries, because people know if you come and do business in the United States, you're going to have access to the courts, and that your contracts are going to be enforced, and the laws that are written will actually be enforced by an impartial judiciary. That gives us a competitive advantage economically, morally, and otherwise. But it's being undermined. But Republicans aren't the only ones that are worried about the president's willingness to bypass the normal legislative process. Yesterday, my colleague from Maine, a Democratic caucus member, urged the White House not to treat Congress as what he called an afterthought. In that spirit, I'd like to remind the president of something he said just a few months ago. He said, quote, "We've got this Constitution. We've got this whole thing about separation of powers. So there's no shortcut to politics, and there's no shortcut to democracy, period," close quote. That's the President of the United States just a few months ago. Yet now he's claiming, I got a phone, I got a pen, I'm going to go it alone. Well, I'd like to remind him of something he also said back in 2006, which is very similar. He said, and I quote, he said, "The founders designed this system, as frustrating as it is, to make sure that there's a broad consensus before the country moves forward, period," close quote. I couldn't agree more with the Barack Obama of 2006 or the Barack Obama of a few months ago. But I couldn't disagree more with the President Obama of today, who somehow has this fantasy. It's nothing better than a fantasy, that somehow he can rise above Congress and the Constitution and the separation of powers, and he can don the robe of a virtual dictator, and he can force the new laws down our throat or force the country in a direction that it doesn't want to go. It's a fantasy. Ain't going to happen. Yet on issue after issue, the president still likes to tell the American people that he can move forward without any regard to consensus or constitutional checks and balances. It's a terrible mistake, and I wish he would reconsider. Well, in addition to its assault on the separation of powers, this administration has targeted other enemies, like its intrusive monitoring of journalists' phone records. It's attempted to shake down private companies to get them to fund Obamacare. It's fostered a culture of intimidation and punished whistleblowers in scandals from Benghazi to Fast and Furious, and now those responsible for the attempt to intimidate the American people, or some parts of the American people, from participating in the political process through the IRS scandal. We know this administration has repeatedly obstructed the investigations and refused to cooperate in the inquiries that would bring the facts out into the light of day so we all can know what happened, make sure those responsible are held accountable, and then, more importantly, make sure it would never happen again. But I'm confident, Mr. President, this is not the record that President Obama will talk about tonight. But this is his record, but it's not too late to change. But his record, his own record, has been what has destroyed his credibility, as well as caused people to question his competence and the federal government's ability to actually deliver on the extravagant promises he's made time and time again. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I'd suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.